my name is Chris Peregin. I'm 32 years old, and I have been working in the media since my university days. I was involved in the student newspaper over there at university, and then from there I got a job at the Times of Malta, which is Malta's leading newspaper. Then I did after about 5 years, I did some work in PR, which was really interesting and has a lot to do with debating as well, because I was effectively a sort of defense lawyer for for the public court of opinion for my clients. But obviously the love and thrill of journalism kind of brought me back into journalism after a while, and I set up my own media outlet called Lovin Malta. It's been 4 years now, and it's fast become not just a household name, but I would say the leading digital media outlet in Malta. And yeah, I'm very interested. I've never done any debating, so I really admire people who do and who have a love for it. I actually have a big love for debate and discussion. It's something that got me involved in the media. In fact, funnily enough, it was a debate that got me my first job at the Times. When I was at university, I organised in 2008 quite an iconic political debate between the four political parties. It was the first time that the four political parties back then were lined up in a timed debate. And it was a really, really big event. It made the front pages of all the newspapers. It was a few days before an election, and the Times called me up after a few days and said, "Listen, you want to start working for us?" So a bit of a strong connection to debates over here in the sense that it was quite an important part of my career. So I think that's it by way of introduction. In these debating competitions, you're very often sort of trying to defeat your opponent explicitly, right, and overtly.
Exactly.
Whereas in the business world, you're trying to do it as subtly and not as possible, but you're still trying to destroy their arguments. Just like say something about that. In the media, it's quite similar
Mm-hmm.
in that sense, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
even
Yes.
though politicians often try to sort of position us as an enemy trying to defeat
Mm-hmm.
their arguments, journalists of good faith generally see it more like a business discussion, in the sense like we're trying to explore issues, we're trying to bring out different sides of an argument, and as you often debate a side that you don't agree with, sometimes journalists have to ask questions that represent a side that they don't agree with. And what's interesting about
Exactly.
that is that you really have to you have to sort of come across in your phrasing as quite neutral, and sometimes even when you have a
Mm-hmm.
very strong opinion, you
Yes.
also want to use that technique. You also want to give off the impression that you are not very emotional about a subject, but you are trying to just ask a question as fairly as possible, mostly because that's more effective as well, in terms of bringing your audience in.
We can look into this, how important it is to use a story or a personal experience when trying to capture the attention of an audience.
Okay, so when it comes to journalism, you have a number of elements in your story. Let's talk about articles, for example. You have a number of elements in your story that confront you with decisions you need to take in terms of the strategy you want to employ. And one of those, probably the most critical one, is your headline, right? And so we spend a lot of time trying. Like what I tell my journalists is that as much time as they spend researching and writing an article, they should probably spend on their headlines, because probably 99% of readers stop at the headline, and very few actually continue. And your headline serves two purposes. One is it needs to tell the whole story, for those 99% that don't read anything else. And two, it needs to try and lure the rest in as much as possible, as many people as possible in. So you have these two sometimes conflicting functions. I want people to click and read the story and keep reading, but I also want people to understand what I'm trying to say in a headline. And I think that tells you something about how important, one, the choice of your words are. And words are obviously our trade, both in debating and in journalism. And the choice of our words can make a really big difference. Sometimes we can be misunderstood. Sometimes we can reveal both latent and overt agendas that can confuse our audiences. Sometimes we can just be bad with our words and we don't bring a message across, so our words are very important, and how able we are to make people relate to our stories. So one of the tricks in a headline, and I would probably argue it's one of the tricks in debating as well, is to try and bring your audience or your readers into the story with you. So the use in journalism, for example, of the word you, or use of the words. Let's say you're writing a story about opportunities for debating students. You want to kind of tell the people, you want to make it quite clear that you're talking about debating for students. So if you're a debating student, and this tip or story is something you really want to learn about, for example, or silly example, but just we try to bring our audience as much as possible into our narrative, even at the get-go, in the headline. For us as well, headlines are the most important, and then you've got the intros that are the second most important thing, because it's just it's your flow of ideas, right? I remember learning quite early on in journalism to unlearn the way we were taught to write in school. So in school, when we'd write essays, we were always taught about an introduction, a middle, and a conclusion. But in journalism, very often you need to start with the conclusion. And I think that's also probably quite a nice way quite a nice thing to use in debates as well, because you want to kind of tell your audience at the get-go what you think, and why this is important to them. And then you want to explain it, and then you want to remind them why it is important again, so you're sort of sandwiching those two things. And that's quite similar in journalism as well. We're quite upfront with the story before we kind of start. I'm just seeing we have two questions, which we have one introduction from India. That's awesome. I love India. Welcome to Anshula. And we've got a question. Do you have any tips as to how best to keep your cool when faced with opposing arguments or when interviewing individuals on controversial topics? Yeah, so I'm quite lucky in that I tend to keep my cool in general. I do very often feel nervous, but I don't feel too emotional too much of the time. And I think one of the reasons is because I learned at an early stage something very something that you can't really unlearn in journalism, which is that every side of a story has another side. Every story has more than one side, and I joined journalism at the age of 20, when I was this very passionate liberal guy living in Malta, which is a highly conservative society, and I was so frustrated about things like not having divorce in the country, not having gay rights in the country, and I was so passionate about these things that I was just ready to crush it, kind of thing, and I kind of saw the world very much as black or white, and I would look for stories that would trigger this in me, this sort of rage or this certainty. But the more stories you write, the more you realize that even when you have that rage and certainty, when you genuinely when you listen to the other side, even if you're forced to listen to the other side. So at the Times, for example, a sense of balance was always really important. So whenever I would write someone's version of a story, I would need to get the other person's version of the story before publishing. And that was the practice, and it's a good practice in journalism. And what it forces you to do is confront your own kind of beliefs and ideas and perceptions about a story. And very often you learn that, you have listened to someone, a really passionate person talking about how they face this massive injustice, and you'd be like, wow, this person is, being really unfairly treated or whatever. And then you call up, let's say, an authority, or you call up the other side of the story, and they explain, oh, but there was this and this that they didn't tell you. And when you experience that time and time again, you start to become really skeptical, not only about what people tell you, but also about what you think, and your ideas. And so if you approach arguments and interviews and controversial topics with that mindset that is ready to be proven wrong. Now, I don't know how that factors in for debating, so you'll have to try and apply that in your own world. But I do know that when you do sort of approach discussions and arguments and conversations from the point of view of, I know that I might be wrong about this, but this is my perspective. And now I'm asking you a question to help clarify my position. And I use that even when I know that I'm not wrong. I use that technique even when I'm completely certain about something. And I just want the other person to know that they've got the full opportunity to give their side. And then if they don't, or they fail to explain something in a coherent way, in a persuasive way, then I know that I'm a bit more right, in that sense. But if I confront, very often journalists make the mistake, I believe. It works for television because it creates drama, but I think journalistically it's a mistake when you're particularly aggressive or conflict, like you really seek the conflict, because people tend to stiffen up, or they tend to not answer the question, or they tend to dismiss the question by saying that it's not being asked in good faith. I believe a lot in this concept of good faith, because I think it's the starting point of conversations. It's the starting point of having a full honest kind of discussion about whatever you're talking about. So I think starting off by checking your own ideas and remembering that you can be wrong, and it's okay to be wrong, and you're genuinely seeking information, makes you quite affable and credible, and makes it easier for you to keep your cool. And then when you're defeating an argument while keeping your cool, that's extremely effective. It shows that that you're just using logic and reason to do so. I like to picture someone like Barack Obama, who I've never seen losing his cool. But I've always seen him be extremely eloquent and effective in his argumentation. On the other hand, I think of someone like Trump, and I think of I think I think in some ways he's a spectacular orator and debater as well. But when he loses his cool, or he looks like he's uncomfortable, it stops being so effective.
So when we are debating, we aren't really looking at a story. Of course, we have a motion, and we need to debate in favor of it or against it, depending whether we're a government or opposition. What kind of tips would you give that would help me kind of poke holes in my opposing team's argument from kind of a journalist's perspective?
Okay. I want to start by mentioning a book that I found really interesting in terms of poking holes in our own arguments very often. It's a book called Factfulness. I don't know if anyone's read it. But I do suggest you read it, because I think it will really open your eyes to a lot of issues. What's interesting about this book is that it's by I believe a data scientist, basically, who spent his life trying to um, sort of question or investigate some of the issues that we take for granted in the world, like that poverty is on the rise, or education is getting worse, or conflict is increasing, and what this person does is he analyzes the data over a large amount of time. He spent his whole life doing it, and he found that very often we have these natural biases that are completely incorrect, right? He actually found that he devised this experiment um, of 10 questions or 12 questions. I read it a while ago, so I'm really paraphrasing here, but let's say female inequality is up. Do you think child poverty is up? Do you think more people are dying of starvation? More, these sorts of things. Um, 5-year-old school children, they got the answers consistently wrong, to the point that if he had asked a bunch of monkeys to answer the questions, and they chose the answers at random, because these were all multiple choice questions, then monkeys would just randomly beat all humans on as humanity, and I think that tells you something a bit about how how uh, how facts are often either misinterpreted or misjudged by our perceptions, or misquoted, and it's a big I think that's from a journalistic perspective, the fact, the data, the true information is the starting point of poking holes in conversations, so very often we'll go to a press conference, and a minister would say something like, oh, we're experiencing such a great economic period right now, or we've never had things so bad in this particular issue, and they've devised their whole, let's say, speech or project or scheme or whatever on the basis of this throwaway argument that they just say, and very often it goes unchecked. And just asking the question of, okay, you said this in the beginning, you made this statement as a statement of fact, but what exactly is the data that proves that? Are you quoting, for example, some data from the 1960s? Something that time has really changed since then. In fact, one of the major points of factfulness is that inequality in the world hasn't increased; it's decreased substantially. Whereas in the 60s, you had a massive difference between developing and developed countries, and many of us grew up with this perception of this massive gap between the developed world and the developing world. In the past few decades, the developing world developed so much that it's incredibly close today to the sort of developed world. And so when we start these arguments based on perceptions that are just, for example, they were accurate, but they were accurate 40 years ago, are they still accurate today? And that's one question that we would ask. It's important to look for these statements of fact that very often are not statements of fact. And almost even if they were statements of fact, even if they're true, probably the person saying them doesn't know where that's coming from, So if you challenge them in a debate, okay, what you're saying this, but where is it coming from? What statistics back it up, and what do we know about this person, I mean, I would argue that in the COVID pandemic, this has happened a bit, where we've taken a lot of things as statements of fact, and we haven't really questioned enough about those things. And very often you have experts. This is part of the problem that comes out in this book. You have experts who might not actually be expert, or they might not actually be quoting relevant science or updated science, and it's very easy for things to get lost. I realize this about science in particular, as a journalist, because as a journalist, your job is to try and find the most interesting thing in your subject matter. So I'll give you an example, a very, very common example in journalism. There'll be some sort of science experiment or survey or report or whatever, and it will be this 50-page thing, and you as a journalist have to extract, as we said before, a headline, something like 9 words or 10 words. And not only should it be a headline, but it needs to be an exciting headline, something that draws people's attention, something unusual, for example. And so it's quite typical of journalists to pick out a small piece of a study, which makes for a very, very good headline. And then once that headline is there, and this all journalists do, whether it's the Guardian, the New York Times, whatever, it's chocolate is good for weight loss now, for example. You see a headline like that, the Daily Mail or something, and science proves, but then if you really look into the data behind that, and if you contest it with other studies, for example, that have said something completely opposite, or you see who's backing the science that came out of, and who's funding it, and how accurate is it, and it's quite easy to poke holes in those sort of. I find it's quite easy to poke holes in numbers in general, because we really I think we tend to, as humans, over dramatize, and we tend to use statistics to confirm our biases, and that can just be quite an easy way of poking holes in someone's arguments, I would say. Okay, we've got another question from Giselle. Thanks for that, Giselle. How do you get people to agree with you or see your point of view when talking or asking questions? Okay, so I think the starting point to that is to try and identify where they disagree, right? Very often people disagree with you on multiple layers, on multiple levels, They might just disagree with you at the get-go because you've said something that's grated them, and it's not really a point at all. It's just like a throwaway element in your argument. So what I like to do is really try to hone in on the aspect that we are fundamentally disagreeing on, So I say, okay, we're agreeing on this, right? And we're agreeing on this, right? So we're not agreeing on this. And that helps to sort of frame, it helps to focus your energy. That's the starting point. And also when you're establishing what you do agree on, I think you're creating a level of cordiality and relatability that puts the other person not in a defensive mode, but in a you get to interest them, and I quite like doing that as well, in the sense of agreeing with them explicitly on something that they don't expect me to agree on them with, sometimes to just kind of remind them that I'm not saying something outrageous here, I'm getting your point over here, I can see your point of view, but what you're forgetting is this element, and I'd like you to think a bit about this a bit more, because I've given this a lot of thought, and while I get all the other things that you're saying, I think here you're missing the point. So even when you disagree, it's important to explain to the person exactly where you disagree with them. And even I find that starting in that way, as opposed, like sometimes I have a conversation with someone, and you say something, and the first thing they say is, "Oh no, you're wrong," and and I just kind of think I'm wrong, like like about everything, I've just spoken for like I can't possibly be wrong about everything, So tell me what I'm wrong on. And I like to do the opposite. If someone tells me, something outrageous or something I totally disagree with, I try to find even the remotest of points on which I can agree with them. And I make that my starting point again. So I say, I agree with you on this, I see your point on this, but there's this and this point as well. So I think that's quite important. I gathered that you make them elaborate their argument. So how far do you dig? Where or when do you stop? Okay, thanks for that question, Gretchen. So I don't always get this right. I remember once interviewing someone and digging so far that he sort of ripped the microphone off and told me to delete the video, So sometimes, and it's quite unpredictable that, because not everyone has the same appetite for questions. To be fair, I was a bit young and petulant at the time, and maybe I didn't employ a lot of these strategies that I do today. I think I think body language is a very important element, of knowing when to stop, or knowing when to create, like, I like to think in terms of ebbs and flows. I think you need to kind of again draw yourself in, take yourself a bit back, be a bit confrontational, and then kind of be a bit more kind of bringing someone to your side as well, so I think you've got to sense the moment, you've got to read a person's body language, and you need to kind of know when you're going too far. I'm quite I would say a very sensitive person, so I'm very conscious when someone is feeling uncomfortable, and I actually really don't like making people feel uncomfortable, which is a bit of a strange thing for a journalist, because you would think journalists would really thrive on making people feel uncomfortable. But I found that sometimes when you make someone feel really comfortable, they screw up, as in it's easier for them to say something they shouldn't say if they don't feel threatened by you. So I believe that a lot, mostly because it's the thing that comes naturally to me. People are wired in different ways, and I really believe in playing to your strengths and to your character. I know that you need to kind of work on it, elements of your character that might not be suitable to use all the time. You need to know when to challenge yourself and your own character in certain situations. I don't love conflict, for example, so I'm not the sort of person who would complain at a restaurant. But in my role, sometimes I need to be in conflict. But I do find that being non-threatening is sometimes a huge weapon. It puts people off their guard. It makes them be more human and more authentic. And when people are more human and more authentic, there's something they need to hide, it comes across a bit more, so yeah, I don't, yeah, how far do you dig? Yeah, I don't know. I guess on the, you've got to decide it on the moment, and you've got to decide it based on the body language, and you've got to decide it based even sometimes on the opportunity. So that's another thing that happens with journalism, in a sort of interview setting. You have the time to make your subjects feel comfortable very often. Especially in newspaper journalism, you might have the luxury of interviewing someone for an hour and a half or 2 hours and then writing the story afterwards. TV journalism, or if you take a comment from a politician, we call them doorstepping, for example, you might only have one moment, one question. And therefore, in that moment, you've got to really dig to the heart of it, So that's where you need to, in some cases, just ask the very, very tough, very intense question that actually gets their attention and very often puts them on the defensive. But that's what you've got to work with at the time. You don't have the luxury of, making them feel comfortable and then asking them. So it does change a lot in terms of journalism. Something I used to like to do, for example, in press conferences, is starting with a soft question. If I'm going to a press conference, for example, to ask something very specific that they really don't want me to ask, I don't ask that question immediately. I like to start by asking something about their press conference, something that they're going to want to be asked, and they feel suddenly very comfortable, and then I follow it up with a very harsh question that even it triggers them. It makes them like you manage to, without, irrespective of their words, they give away how they're feeling, by showing that distinction. So sometimes that's quite fun as well and useful, which is to kind of show someone, like to give a person this like mixed messaging.
I have another question, pretty much based on what you've been saying regarding journalism and the different questions and the tough questions that you have to ask, because obviously every story has two sides and there are different angles to it. So how do you make your narrative more interesting through the angle you take? And how do you determine whether one angle is more appropriate than another angle?
I guess that's obviously so. Like I said, journalism is all about choices, right? And there's a lot of things that go into the choices of angles. Sometimes it could be something as simple as another paper or another website has already run with that angle, and so you need to take a different one. So it's not always necessarily about your opinion per se. It might just be the requirement. This is the biggest news element, this is the most new thing that has come out of this story. But there's journalism and journalism, right? So there's kind of reporting, which is the sort of straight reporting that requires you to again go with the fact that is most important, the new fact that is most important to most people, let's say. But then there is kind of analysis, or there's investigative journalism, or there is opinion writing. And with those, you have more of a choice in terms of what to go with. You mentioned angle and narrative, and sometimes you have that choice. And again, there's a lot of things at play. So one of the questions we ask ourselves is, what would most people care about in this story? And what would the people who are most affected by this story care about? So, for example, you might have a story about, I don't know, schools closing because of COVID. And you're trying to target your article to parents, let's say, or you might say, okay, parents are really going to care about this even more than students, and so you talk about the ramifications of those. I think what I like to think about is one, like getting people's attention. So starting with maybe something surprising or out of the ordinary or unusual. I think that really works, when you surprise people with an angle they're not expecting. I also think it's important to choose angles that, you know, will get people talking in journalism. That's quite important. And the idea of sort of reaching out to an audience. I'll give you an example actually that's coming to mind. There was a time, I mean, in Malta, for those who don't follow, you know, we had a lot of political turmoil over the past couple of years. And there were moments where the party in government was doing some really crazy things that were clearly not things that the party stood for and that the party members would have stood up for, you know. And also as journalists, to be able to kind of expose those things, we needed the help of people within this party because it had become too homogenous. There were too many people not criticizing it internally, you know. So I remember writing an article called Will the Real Labour Party Please Stand Up? And the point of that article was I wanted to show the Labour Party members that they are the genuine people within that party are the real Labour Party, you know, and it's not the people maybe running the party who might have you know, a lot of things to hide or a lot of things to, you know what I mean? And that article was probably one of the most effective articles I had ever written. I remember so many people getting in touch with me. I developed so many new sources through that article because they really felt that I understood the zeitgeist. I understood their feeling. And I think when you show someone that you really understand where they're coming from, you know, that you know exactly what they're thinking, you need to get into their minds and you need to say, okay, this person feels, you know, that they can't win either way. You know, if they criticize their party, they're going to be ostracized by the party. If they don't criticize the party, then everyone's going to think, yeah. And if they do criticize the party, the people who hate the party are going to hate them anyway. So they're not going to win anyway. But getting into that frame of mind and showing them how well you understand their feelings and their reality makes them respond to that very well. So I do think very often what we need to do is put ourselves in the shoes of our opponents or our subjects, and just really try to understand where they're coming from, you know, why they think the way they do, and what is preventing them from agreeing with us, you know, why can't they see something so clear that we can see? And very often it's because they feel fearful, or because they feel, you know, that you hate them, or they feel that you'll never understand them. And as soon as you show that you do understand them, you understand them very well, then it kind of falls apart, you know. People it's like they melt, you know, and they realize, okay, I can speak to you now. I know that you get me. So again, it's about relatability. It's about showing someone where you agree with them, you know. And to do that journalistically, the best way of doing that journalistically is to actually speak to those people, you know. So I could only write an article like that because I had spoken to enough friends within the Labour Party to understand their problem. And then I represented that, you know, in my own words, but in words that they were using themselves in conversations. And I made it very specific. I don't remember exactly the article, but by way of example, you know, I said things like, you know, I know you're having those WhatsApp conversations with yourselves, you know, in your group saying, you know, this is something we shouldn't tolerate, you know, and I get you can't say that in public, but it's important that you realize that, you know, it's not a good place to be forced in that situation, you know, and we can see through it, you know. I know that that's happening. And that, I think, as I'm sure anyone in advertising knows, you know, very often you just need to show how well you understand what someone is thinking and where they're coming from. It's a sensitive subject. Yes, that's a good question. So yeah, I think preparation is so important. I say, having prepared nothing for today's session. Um, but I do actually think preparation is really important if you're going to do something. And journalists don't often have that preparation time, and it's usually used against us, right? So it's very easy for a politician, for example, to call a press conference very, very quickly before something happens. They say what they have to say, and before you're able to really understand what they're saying, it's finished, and then you don't have the opportunity to ask a question. So journalists are trained to prepare themselves extremely quickly, and that comes from, for example, having to write day in, day out about subjects that we know nothing about, and we just need to brush ourselves up into a subject very, very quickly. We become extremely good at Googling information, extremely good at knowing who to call for information. I like to think that the only skill I learned, the only knowledge I actually know, is how to find the knowledge I need to know at the time. I'm not the sort of person who has, tons of general knowledge, but I do know how to find the information. That's enough for me, as a journalist, if I can be super efficient at finding that information. So, in terms of preparation time, it depends, I guess, on your efficiency in terms of preparing. But there are so many ways you can prepare. There's one way is to just kind of read about a subject and just know that you've got, all the information and all the background, so that if someone says something that's incorrect or dodgy or whatever, you can correct them. I'll give you a funny example, especially because there are so many women on this call. Recently, I had to do a program about football. I hate football. I don't follow it at all. I have no insights whatsoever. But there was this big football issue in Malta, and I said, okay, this is going to be good for a program. So I did one of these. I do a show called COVID Calls, which is a talk show on one of these Zoom chats. Anyway, so I had 3 football coaches complaining about how the league was given, etc. And just before the call, I said, okay, I really need to just put some notes, somewhere with the facts of how this league was called, etc. And so I had this coach talking about how, this football manager talking about how, his team was had lost on all counts. This decision by the Malta Football Association had benefited everyone else in different ways except his team. They got nothing, because the association decided to stop the league and appoint the winners and whatever. And as he was talking, I see my notes and I see all the different football leagues involved, and there was one league which was the women's football league, which he won. His team had actually won according to this vote. So as he was talking very passionately, I lost everything, we lost everything, it's so unfair, no, we're the only team that got nothing out of this, blah blah. And then I was just but you won the women's league. And he was so dumbfounded by that. He was just yeah, wonderful. So who cares about that, And it made him look really silly in a way, But it was just a fun, and what was fun about it is that obviously I had no idea about anything, but all it took was a few notes on the side of how the league was actually divided for me to be able to plug in that question and drop his argument, and if I hadn't prepared in that way, then I wouldn't have had the opportunity to do that, So I think even when you don't understand the subject, it's really important to just bring as much data as possible. I also think it's good to, if you're going to interview someone, for example, it's good to watch previous interviews and know how they would and try and predict how they would answer. Sometimes when I've got a very big interview, I like to actually rehearse the interview with someone else and tell them to read the questions to me, and I will channel the answer of my subject. And with some politicians who we follow very regularly, for example, we really know exactly how they would answer, you know, and sometimes it's uncanny how spot on we get it in our rehearsals, you know, and we're like, when I ask this question, he's going to answer like this for sure, you know, and then I'm going to ask this follow-up question, and then he's going to answer like this, and then sure enough, that's exactly how it happens in the interview. And that's just a very good way of being prepared, because what you don't want to do is to be really proud and cocky about your question, and then, you know, they answer in a way that defeats you immediately. You know, you just need to predict how the person is going to be responding. In terms of complicated and sensitive subjects, you know, in particular the question, yeah, it's even more so, you know, even more so you need to prepare, you need to know what is complicated and sensitive about it, you know, you need to know what language you can use and you cannot use. And you need to, another thing that tends to happen is, that tends to be something I like to do, is to declare when you don't know much, you know. So for example, coming to this session, you know, I declared immediately that I have never done any form of debating, that I have a love for debate, but I don't consider myself a debating trainer in any way. And so that's a good way of managing expectations as well, you know, because you don't want to pretend you're an expert and then be challenged and realize that you're not an expert at all, you know. So I think managing expectations is also important in this sense, but preparation, definitely an important one. You asked about specific preparation time. Obviously that depends on the time you've got available and the time and the importance of what you're preparing for. It's very difficult to give a time. As journalists, we're again trained to be extremely efficient. So you know, I wouldn't give myself more than an hour or two sometimes to prepare for a big interview even, you know. Nicole, I think you were going to ask another question before we found this one of Diana.
Yes. So my question is, so as a journalist, as much as possible, one needs to be unbiased and detached from a story. So that's kind of no personal and political views or bias influence the story itself. In debating, sometimes we will end up having to debate in favor of an argument we're completely against. Just like sometimes you would need to cover a story on a topic you're not that fond of. So how do you make your argument believable then?
Okay. So just the first part of your question, I want to say that, like, you know, there are instances when you don't need to be that neutral. You know, there are instances where in certain kinds of journalism where actually your bias or your identity can be very powerful. You know, if I'm a black journalist, for example, talking about the George Floyd situation in America, for those who didn't follow, you know, the black guy was basically choked to death by a policeman, a horrific thing. Then being a black journalist adds, you know, like you might want to even use that in terms of your transmission of a story and your passion. You know, I also remember this Asian journalist, for example, who was questioned by Trump recently. I don't know if you've seen that video. But you know, she asked the question, and then Trump responded by saying, "You should go ask China that." And she was like, "Are you fucking kidding me? Like, why are you telling me I should go ask China?" You know, it was like, but it was, you know, he was obviously using her identity, and she used it back in a way or other, you know. So sometimes that can be really effective. But yes, when your other question is kind of about being neutral when you or having to debate the opposing side, right? That's what you're asking about. And yeah, again, very often in journalism we do argue, we do have to represent the other side even if we don't agree with it, you know. Now, going back to what I said earlier about the importance of being fair and being open-minded and being ready to be proven that you're wrong, that, you know, if you employ that strategy even when you're very passionate about something, it's actually quite easy to employ it as well when you're not very passionate about something, or you reflect the other side, because you know that as a journalist your role is to ask a question and help someone, and I like to see it as being, the more challenging my question is, the greater it is an opportunity for you to make your point heard. So sometimes, even if I am actually, sometimes I do the opposite of this. I would feel very, very strongly about something, right? In favor of something, for example. And I would ask the question that fully represents the other side of that debate as convincingly as possible, to give the subject the opportunity to make that opposing argument, and to crush that argument that I don't believe in, But I want it, like, the better formed it is as an opinion and as a question, the easier it is, or the more effective it is if the response is a good one. And I guess, like, I wonder what that's like in debating, because you're going to try and win on a point that you totally don't agree with. And that, I think that's quite fun, actually, as in, like, I think that's a really interesting thing to do. And the more, and I think journalists would be really good at that, because, like I said, we do have a natural appreciation for the different sides of an argument, and just as you would, crush a person's argument, if you're good at relating to someone and understanding what their point of view is, it can be quite easy then to represent their point of view even when you disagree with it, and that's something, again, in journalism you kind of train for that. In fact, probably some experience in journalism would help you debate in that sense. I mean, Nicole, you're a journalist yourself, so probably that's combined over there.
Speaking about investigative journalism, so the main aim of the work is to expose and shed light on important matters, very often that are crucial to the upkeeping of democracy even. So if you have to take investigative journalism tactics as with debating, do you believe that it would make sense to look into investigative journalism tactics when it comes to debating hot topics? Do you see that there's sort of a correlation in using those tactics with on a debating platform?
Probably, yes, because, again, the investigative journalism, the starting point, I guess, is trying to get to the heart of a story, right? Trying to understand. It's asking questions. It's trying to get enough. So very often with investigative journalism, you've been told a piece of information, for example, you've been told, this person is corrupt in this way, they've done this, blah, blah, blah. And then you need to start building the facts. So you need to ask, you need to try and, like, turn it into a bit of a puzzle and start saying, okay, so this piece of the puzzle, I need to get that confirmed, and then this piece of the puzzle, and then that, and that, and that. And I think that really is something similar. You would do something similar with debating, right? With constructing your argument. You want to divide it into pieces of the puzzle to explain your point of view. And so I do think that is a very those techniques are quite useful. Again, because to be effective and credible in investigative journalism, you need to be right with your facts. You need to really make sure your argument doesn't fall apart with a very important piece of the puzzle, and I think it's the same with debating. You don't want to have this really great, this really great speech, and you realize it's founded on a fact that's very easy to contradict, and that's something journalists are constantly afraid of. And so they prepare, and they ask questions, and they verify information, they second source information as well. So yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. We also have another question over here by Nele. How do you go into a debate with someone like Trump, who doesn't really debate with journalists with a different view? How do you advise someone who will have to debate with a journalist? Those are two separate questions, correct? Okay. How do you go into a debate with someone like Trump, who doesn't really debate with journalists with a different view? Yeah, it's tough, but I think, sometimes I watch these like White House press conferences and I say, how the hell would I deal with this? Because it's so antagonistic. It's so, and it's not like we have a free ride in Malta. We have some very antagonistic politicians, but the level of audacity sometimes with someone like Trump is quite unbelievable. And again, very effective audacity sometimes, because there is this charisma, this strange brand of charisma, of authority, of certainty, in the way he speaks, and journalists can't, like, this is one of the issues that journalists face. Politicians like Trump throw us into the realm of opposition when that is not really our realm. Our realm is to ask questions, to get facts, we're not there to debate, and we're not given the same platform to debate. So it's an unfair pairing that sometimes he does, when he speaks to a journalist as if he's, as if they're part of the opposition. It's actually extremely disrespectful for journalists to be treated in that way, and politicians know how much it triggers us, and they know how and they really enjoy using that tactic, because it's like, they run away from debates with each other, and then they can look like they're debating with a journalist who's just there getting like the opportunity to ask one question. So how do you do it? I guess it depends as well on how much time you have, whether it's like one question or another, or several questions. A lot of what goes into it is trying to really choose the right question. So what we do as journalists is, if we're going to a press conference, we try to assess, okay, not just kind of what question do we want to ask, but what question is going to get this person's attention? What question is going to trigger this person? What question is going to get into their minds and force them to actually, be real with us, and that is a lot about human psychology. You need to know about your subject a lot. You need to understand what makes them tick, what triggers them, and you have to use that to your advantage. So that's one of the things I would do going into something really difficult, like a debate with Trump. I would really try to evaluate what he's sensitive towards, what scares him, what makes him feel, what's going to get him to be real. And what we like to do in the newsroom is test these questions, not test them, but debate them to the point, where we're saying, okay, we're going to ask this question, and someone will say, oh no, but he's either been asked this question, or he never answers this question, or it's not like good enough, or it's a good way to challenge those, with other people. I think that's a good form of preparation, to try and check your preparation with other people. I think that's the best piece of advice I can give there. How would you advise someone who will have to debate with a journalist to prepare? Okay, so now we're flipping. It's like giving Trump the advice. It's quite difficult for me to say that, like, kind of objectively, because like there's a subjective nature to it. I would say that they should be respectful to the journalist. I would say that they should understand that the journalist is not there to be confrontational or to be in opposition, but it's there to give you an opportunity to be the best version of yourself and to ask a question in the most effective way possible. So I wouldn't be, I wouldn't be afraid of journalists, but I would try to plan and understand what they. So I used to do this quite a lot actually when I was in PR. I was a PR consultant for a lot of controversial companies, actually. And I was specialized in kind of crisis communication. That's the thing I enjoy doing most, planning for a crisis, for example, and managing the communications in a crisis. And when you do that, for example, when we had interviews, we would do a lot of research about the journalists who are going to interview and what they would have been writing about, what interests them, so that you predict the questions. So I would have prepared a number of my clients by, obviously that was my strength as a PR consultant, that I am a journalist, so I knew exactly what the journalist would. So that's one piece of advice: prepare yourself by getting in a journalist or someone with journalism expertise and trying to kind of assess how they would, what they would ask you about. And so that's what I liked to do. I like to create these like mock interviews where I come up with the most horrendous of questions. And in fact, I was often let down because I would have prepared my client for these really, really, really tough questions, and then we'd go into a press conference and no one even asks a question. It's like, God, man, my client must think I'm a real asshole, for coming up with these questions, So yeah, it's good to prepare yourself in that way.
Okay, yeah. So since debating and interviewing are similar in ways of going around in circles in order for you to get your point across and to win an argument, and I've heard that you were crisis management before in PR. So if you correlate your how you manage this crisis with the media, preparing for the journalist interview and all that, how do you actually connect with your audience in a debatable way for them? So how do you actually debate for your audience and connect with them at the same time, especially if you're the one managing the crisis?
Okay.
Because you're like, we're talking about media.
So to be clear, it's like you're in a position where you need to confront your audience.
Yes.
An idea that they don't necessarily like, but you want to be relatable to them as well at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think there's been quite a lot of that in the COVID situation, in a way, where not the best example, but something that's coming to mind. When politicians have had to face the public and tell them, stay home. You can't leave the house. You can't go and see your elderly parents. You like, maybe it's not as confrontational as you had in mind, but or another thing actually could be, imagine you're a politician in Minneapolis at the moment. Is that where the murder happened? I think so. And you've got riots in the street, and your job is to stop those riots, but at the same time, you know why those riots are happening, and you understand them. And I think even in Malta we face those situations, where the government had to, when there were a lot of protests in the streets, where the government had to confront the people, but also try and find a way of keeping them on their side in some way. Anyway, probably the Minneapolis is the best example of what you're talking about. Again, I think it's about into people's shoes and showing them how much you understand their point of view, even though they're wrong. Even though like the starting point has to be that. The starting point needs to be, here's where we agree, here's where I understand, and you understand with as many specifics as possible. Like, I can't stress this enough. This is like, when you listen to a song and it really resonates with you, it's usually because the lyrics are surprisingly specific. You know, a song, you know, I love you, blah blah, might not be specific enough to trigger that. You know, but a song with whose lyrics make you say, wow, man, this person, like, even if it's not exactly what you've experienced, you just say, the specifics of it really resonate with me, you know. And so I think that's an important technique, you know, to understand, to show people as clearly as possible, as many specifics as possible, where you agree with them. And then once you've onboarded them by showing them that you understand them, then you can say, you're wrong on this point, and this is what I need you to do. You know, I do this very much in management as well. Obviously, I've got a team. I employ 20 people, and there are so many issues, so many things that you experience as a manager. You know, so many times when you want to tell someone, you're so wrong for what you've just done, you know, this is crazy, like, you know, you want to fire them sometimes, you know, but you also know that you need them, you want them to be better, you want them to be motivated. I like to use that, like, you know, sandwiching technique of starting with where we agree, you know, explaining where we don't and being firm over there, but then ending again with something positive about, let's say, the hopefulness. And I think hope is a very useful technique over here as well. You know, you need to show people that, you know, even if we're not agreeing here, there is a shared future. You know, we can reach a shared vision. There is an area where we can meet in the middle. And yeah, that's, I think, the best way of relating to someone, being specific, and really bothering to understand them. And that's challenging sometimes if you're not open-minded enough, you know, and you're not sensitive enough and empathetic enough. Sometimes you find that very difficult. I personally don't, you know, because I've been trained in this field, and that's been a really interesting education, because it's made me extremely open to all sides, sometimes to a fault, you know. Sometimes you kind of say, oh, you should get angrier more, you know. you shouldn't be more black and white, because you start to feel a bit too relativist. But being that way can make for great debating. First of all, thank you for having me, and thanks for asking the questions. It was really nice to get these particular questions, and I hope it was more useful this way than if I came with a fancy presentation. It was also much easier for me to prepare for. But I think some of the most important points that we raised, to just kind of summarize, I think the importance of facts and preparation, right? That's the currency of journalists, and I think it can be the currency of debaters on both sides, both to bring out your argument, solidify your argument, but also to poke holes in someone else's arguments. And don't forget how often people misquote facts or get facts wrong, or expose themselves to incorrect or outdated data. And don't forget to buy the book Factfulness, because I think you'd love it. The other thing is getting into empathy, you know, really getting into someone's shoes, and understanding to ridiculous detail sometimes, you know, what someone is thinking and what someone is experiencing and how someone feels, and then use that to show them that you do understand them. And you can use that then to create these strategies of showing someone where you agree with them and leading them onto the point where you fundamentally disagree with them. And therefore you kind of contain the argument, you know. I'm not criticizing your entire identity or your entire belief system or anything like that. I'm just saying, on this tiny point, you're really, really, really wrong. And that can be a nice way of debating. I think some of the basic techniques of journalism can be really handy for debaters. Investigative journalism, you know, the way we seek facts and learn how to get very good at searching for facts efficiently. and in terms of the attitude, you know, I think it's good to question our beliefs, to be prepared to be proven wrong, and to engage in an open and honest and good faith way where we are like really open to discussion, you know, in a real way and an honest way, and sometimes to use that even when it's very difficult for you to do so, even when it's not the case, even when you've got a very strong agenda on an issue. It's good to make someone feel that that you don't, and that you're willing to hear them out, you know. So I hope that was useful to you guys. Really nice to meet you all from all your different and beautiful countries. And thanks for having me, JCI.